When I was young, my grandmother used to tell me stories, dark, haunting stories that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She had a way of describing things so vividly that I could almost feel the cold, the fear, the whispers in the dark. Of all her tales, there was one that she swore was true. She would tell it with a trembling voice, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving every moment. She said it happened when she was 10 years old, living in a small weathered house at the edge of a village. This wasn't the kind of village you see in movies or read about in cheerful books. It was isolated, almost forgotten, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in closer with each passing year. The nights there were quiet, too quiet. It wasn't peaceful, she'd say. It was the kind of silence that made you feel watched, even when you were alone. From her tiny bedroom window, she could see a narrow path that twisted its way through the village and disappeared into the forest. She used to spend hours staring at it, wondering where it led and what might be waiting at the end. It was a fascination she couldn't explain, like the path was calling to her. One night, when the fog came early and thick, she heard something that made her freeze. At first, she thought it was the wind. It was faint, just a murmur, but it didn't sound like any wind she'd ever heard before. She lay in bed, holding her breath, listening as the sound grew clearer. It wasn't the wind at all. It was whispers. Curiosity got the better of her. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The glass was cold under her fingertips as she wiped away the condensation, peering out into the fog. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling mist, gray and endless. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. She told me they weren't human, not really. They looked human at first glance, but there was something off about them. Too pale, too still. They stood in a circle on the path, their heads tilted as if they were speaking to each other. The whispers came from them, soft and rhythmic, like a chant. She couldn't make out the words, but she said they made her stomach twist, like hearing something you weren't meant to know. She watched them for what felt like hours, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the windowsill. She'd told me she should have looked away, but she couldn't. The figures didn't move like people. Their gestures were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. One of them raised a hand, a long, pale hand, and pointed toward the forest. That's when Peter appeared. Peter was a fisherman, a quiet man who always seemed to be out late, checking his nets by the river. She saw the glow of his lantern first, a faint orange light swinging as he walked down the path toward the figures. He didn't see them, she'd say, shaking her head. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to believe it. Peter walked straight into the mist, passing right through the circle of figures. For a moment, he paused. He turned his head as if he'd heard something and looked over his shoulder. But there was nothing there, at least nothing he could see. He stood there for a moment, frowning, then shook his head and kept walking. That was when the whispers changed. My grandmother said they grew louder, sharper, and angrier. The figures turned their heads, or what should have been heads, toward the road where Peter had just been. And then, slowly, they all turned to face her window. She backed away from the glass, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head. But even there, she could hear the whispers. They didn't stop. They scratched at her thoughts, curling into her ears like they were trying to pull her into the mist with them. When she finally worked up the courage to peek out from under the blanket, the room was silent again. But something had changed. She looked toward the window, and her blood ran cold. There, on the outside of the glass, was a handprint. It wasn't like any hand she'd ever seen. The fingers were long and thin, stretching wider than they should have. The palm was fogged over, as if the hand had pressed against the glass from the mist itself. She didn't sleep that night. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she swore she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling her back to the window. And that, she told me, was only the beginning. My grandmother told me that things got worse after that night. She said Peter was the first to feel the weight of whatever he had crossed. It started small, things that could have been explained away. His dog refused to go near him, barking and growling whenever Peter came close. Then his chickens stopped laying eggs. Within a few days, his livestock started dying, one by one. Healthy animals, perfectly fine the day before, were suddenly found cold and lifeless in their pens. At first, the villagers tried to comfort him, telling him it was probably a sickness spreading among the animals. But when Peter himself began to change, they stopped looking for simple explanations. My grandmother told me Peter went blind overnight. One morning he woke up and couldn't see a thing. He stumbled out of his house calling for help, his voice shaking with fear. But that wasn't the worst of it. His wife fell sick next, feverish and weak, coughing so hard she could barely speak. Then their children followed, one after the other, as if something had crept into their home and decided to stay. She said it was like watching a family crumble under an invisible hand, each blow more devastating than the last. The villagers began to whisper. My grandmother said she overheard the elders speaking in hushed voices outside her house late at night. They were afraid, and for good reason. They believed Peter had crossed paths with the spirits, that his mistake had unleashed something terrible on the village. She told me they spoke of an old ritual, something they hadn't performed in generations. The spirits, they said, were restless and bound to the land. Each night they gathered in a different place, whispering their secrets into the mist. The whispers were a warning. Anyone who walked through them while they spoke would be cursed. And that night, it had been Peter. The village was desperate. The elders decided to try a ritual of their own, though no one knew exactly what to do. My grandmother said they gathered in the center of the village, a small group of them clutching candles and muttering prayers. She watched from a distance, hiding behind the corner of her house, her young mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. She told me it was chaotic and eerie. The candles flickered in the cold wind, threatening to go out at any moment. The villagers were chanting, but the words didn't sound right, not even to them. It was as if they were trying to piece together something they barely understood, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. The ritual didn't work. Instead of quieting the spirits, it seemed to make them angrier. My grandmother said she felt it, a shift in the air, like the village itself was holding its breath. And then, at the edge of the forest, she saw them again, the spirits. They were watching from the shadows, their pale forms barely visible in the darkness. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. She told me it turned and looked directly at her. She said its eyes were hollow, like empty sockets, but somehow they still managed to hold an unspoken threat. It didn't move closer. It didn't reach her. It just stood there, staring, as if it knew something she didn't. And then it whispered her name.
Clara.
When she told me this part of the story, her voice dropped to a whisper. That was when I knew, she said. They weren't just angry at Peter. They were watching all of us, waiting. And now, as I tell you this story, I realize maybe it wasn't just her they were watching,